one line of this research on the math behind how your brain learns math. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Prather.
Sorry, I have the enterprise over here. You don't have to apologize. I like that. Also move on to the talk. So the talk that I have written for today is kind of broad and high level. I go over a couple different research projects that I've done in my lab just to give you kind of an idea of what my approach is and some of the findings I have in my lab. So I'll go over a couple of different studies, and a lot of what I want to talk about is kind of what is the approach that my lab has, what is the point of that particular approach, like the modeling. Some people think that computational modeling is great. I do. Some might ask something like, why in the world would you spend your time doing that? And so I want to talk a little bit about the place of computational modeling in asking the kind of questions I'm interested in. So our basic outline here is I'm going to give everyone a basic introduction. I assume everyone here knows everything about numerical cognition, number areas in the brain, things like that. I'll give you like a very quick introduction in terms of what's going to be important for this talk. Talk a little bit about why you might model that. So go over a couple of results we've had from modeling it. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to seem like this kind of high-level, kind of philosophical stuff about psychology and what sorts of data we use and what sorts of questions we ask. So you'll see in part 2 here, I talk about individual number cognition. So I kind of move from having these kind of group level findings where I talk about how all the 5-year-olds are behaving and talk more about, well, why one particular 5-year-old is doing really well on the math task and this other one isn't. That's kind of the direction that my research has been going. Less of these kind of big ANOVAs where I just say group A did this, group B did that, and more. We have all these participants, they're all over the place. Why are some doing really poorly with basic number and some are doing really well? We need to figure out what's going on with all these individual differences. And that's kind of the direction my research has been moving. Another thing that I've been doing a little bit, I'm not sure how much I'll get into, some neuroscience angle. Even though I, a long time ago, back at MIT, got experience with fMRI. One of the great things I learned about fMRI at the time is that I probably didn't want to do it. I moved into EEG. And I'll talk a little bit why I think EEG is better for me, personally, not necessarily for everyone. But EEG works a little better for me in answering these questions. And one thing that's kind of like a general thing that I'm going to talk about maybe a little bit more at the end and a little bit in my other talk is some of these studies I talk a lot about the individual learner or the learners in general, so kind of like group average data. What my lab has been trying to do is move a little bit more to studying something a little more complicated, which is more like these individual learners in their context. So you can imagine we can get kind of cognitive or behavioral data from an individual that comes into the lab, potentially also neuroscience data. So the EEG system that I have is really nice. It's kind of a portable wireless system. We also want to think about the external environment. So we have 5, 6, 7-year-old kids coming into the lab. They're coming from different backgrounds. They have very different external environments. When they come into the lab, the traditional thing for developmental psychologists is to ignore all that. You just come in the lab, do your task, you talk about that. So we're trying to stop ignoring that. The first step is doing things like getting data from the parent about the home environment. That's kind of like a most simple way to do that, and we've started doing that in a few new projects we have. And also kind of taking the environment part of that kind of literally. So I actually have a collaboration with a researcher in public health who's interested in air pollution. So we're doing this collaboration about cognitive development and how it's affected by air pollution. It's not great. I mean, it's bad. So you don't want to be near any high pollutant areas, which basically means every street. So we'll get into that because of cars. So to get into what the goals of my lab kind of have been, so I originally wrote this task wrote this talk about a year ago. And I realized that somehow I would phrase my goals are kind of slightly different. So one way to think about what my lab does is we try to get into these kind of precise characterizations of the cognitive process involved in doing math and number tasks. So there are all these math and number tasks that the researchers really like. What exactly is going on when you are doing a simple arithmetic task or even just kind of number comparison? My main way of looking at that is with computational modeling and sometimes a little bit of the EEG data. So this is my fancy new EEG setup. It's nice because it's wireless, so you can just kind of walk around if you want to study walking. The goal, or kind of the very high-level goal of thinking about this, if you think about children in an educational context, is this idea of kind of like individually customized math instruction based on data from that particular individual, not the group average. So children are going to be at different places in a classroom. You want to be able to customize your instruction for each one based on what you know about that individual learner. This is what teachers who are good teachers do naturally based on what they know about the children and their experience in teaching math. So I'm involved in a couple of projects of thinking about what cognitive science can do to kind of help with that. So what do we know about the cognitive processes that can help talk to the teachers about individual differences between different children and why some are doing very poorly and others are kind of doing good. So the basics to start out with, talking about number. So this is my slide when I teach number. This is IPS, intraparietal sulcus. That is the number area of the brain. I put it in quotes because it's a complicated issue. But most of the either fMRI or EEG research that talks about human behavior and number is focused on that area. And the basic idea here is that there's some number-sensitive neurons that you have in that area. So if I were to give you a simple number task, you would see some activity there that seems to correspond with what number you are looking at. So I'm showing you a bunch of dots on the screen, 2 dots, 20 dots, 2 million dots. We can kind of look at the activity in that area and see how it correlates based on what numbers you're looking at. It seems like this basic number comparison task, and the basic number comparison task is everyone's favorite task. You see a bunch of dots here, a bunch of dots there, you tell me which side is more dots, basically. There are many variations on that, and there are many studies that have used it. But basically, it uses an indice of numeracy. So kind of the better you are at that task, the better your numeracy is. And it seems like, and I say seems like because it's been an open question, and there have recently been some meta-analyses looking at this, that your numeracy, as measured by how you're doing on this non-symbolic comparison task, correlates with how well you're doing on all sorts of kind of symbolic arithmetic tasks, like the kind of thing you actually do at school. So this basic non-symbolic task, where you're just looking at dots on the screen, seems to correlate with how well you're doing in like Algebra 2. And that seems a little outrageous. Do you think Algebra 2 is really complicated? What does that have to do with just kind of non-symbolic comparison? But there have been a couple of meta-analyses showing that there seems to be a moderately strong effect even when you account for other things like executive functioning and other things you might want to kind of regress out, that suggests that numeracy really does seem to account for some variation in outcomes on these things like your SAT math scores or something like that. So the big question, if it seems to be a real connection there, is why and how does that actually kind of work out? So my contribution here is to look at these computational models of numeracy, or kind of processes involved in doing these simple number tasks. The first way I started out doing that was by reading a monkey paper. So monkeys can do number, not a lot. They can do kind of non-symbolic comparison, basically where's there more food, essentially. They can be trained up, and with monkeys you can get data from kind of the monkey version of the number area, monkey IPS, which is kind of slightly different data. And based on that data from it's actually just kind of one guy who does this. So currently there's one person in the world, I think, who does research with non-human primates and thinks number is interesting. So it's his thing. So what you find here in IPS is these neural populations that seem to be sensitive to number, and you can kind of think of these as kind of neural tuning curves. So the idea here is that if you're looking at a set of objects on the screen, so there are 5 objects here, you look at the relative firing rate of different neural populations. So the horizontal axis there is just me labeling different neural populations. So population 3, population 4, population 5. The way they get named is they get named for which number they are, quote, selected for. So population number 5 is most selective for seeing 5 objects. So a very kind of high-level way of thinking about this is that there's some population, that's population 5, that sit around waiting to see 5 objects, or to hear someone say the number 5. And it is most active when you get that. So you can use that to kind of create these neural tuning curves that are basically like how your brain is representing number when you're viewing 5 objects. It basically looks like that. You can actually go look at the monkey data. It doesn't look as smooth as this nearly, but this is what it looks like in the actual model. An important detail from one of those papers is that when the monkeys made errors on this task, there seemed to be a correlation with a, quote, error in the neural tuning curve. So they saw variations in the neural data that came out on trials where there was a behavioral error and the monkey got it wrong. So this link between behavioral errors and neurocoding, quote, errors is where I first started. So you can think about how these neural tuning curves work out for a number comparison. By the way, so which side do you think has more dots? No counting.
Right.
I don't actually know the right answer. This is one of my stimulus files. I just pulled it out and copied it and put it in here. I don't know what it is. Sure, this one. But you can imagine getting a lot of these. It's a little tricky. So imagine you have, there's a lot of overlap here. So the basic idea is that you kind of have neural tuning curves for both of these. The closer the 2 values are, the more overlap there is. The harder it is to distinguish the 2. So it is a little bit like signal detection theory, if anyone is aware of that. See, it's kind of the same thing. When there's a lot of overlap in representation, it's hard to differentiate the 2. So if you're interested in neural tuning curves and modeling them, there are a lot of different characteristics that you could model. So there's just kind of the breadth. So assuming you have a neural tuning curve, how wide is the curve? Is it really narrow and precise, or is it really wide? You can look at the peak. So I've kind of been ignoring it up to this point, but the vertical axis is firing rate. The firing rate is not kind of standard. There's not like a standard max firing rate for all neurons, like they just hit 100 and that's it. It can actually vary quite a bit. And then there's the variability. So I said before the data actually looks a little messy if you look at the actual monkey data. What you don't get if you expect, let's say, a firing rate of 50 hertz from a certain neural population is that you just hit 50 and sit there. There's a little bit of variability in there. It may be between trial variability, so what it looks like when you view 5 now versus viewing 5 later, or within that trial, if you're looking at 5 objects for a second, do you expect it to kind of hit 50 hertz and sit there, or is it going to kind of go up and down quite a bit? So there are a lot of things to potentially model here. So in part 1, I'd like to go over what was my first attempt to model these neural tuning curves and actually somehow connect this all to human behavior. And the first thing I did was I actually went into, I think, one of the most popular number tasks, maybe the second most popular one behind the non-symbolic comparison, which is the number line. Number line is actually really, really cool for kind of a weird reason. So the number line task is pretty simple. A lot of you have seen a number line before. the idea of linking number to space probably doesn't seem unusual to you. The way this task works is I ask you to put a given number between 0 to 100 on the line. You mark the line. If this is on a computer, you use the mouse. If it's written, so sometimes they do this in schools, where each sheet of paper has one number line on it, so the kid just uses a pencil and marks it. Kids are bad at it. They might do something like this. That's wrong. The great thing about the developmental data is that kids are really bad, which is, you need that as a developmental psychologist. They're bad in a very particular way. It's not just they rip up the paper and say, I'm not doing this. They're kind of like reliably bad. And they tend to do things like this. They'll have 10 in the middle and 50 way over there where you know that it should be like 80 goes there, but they don't know that. So the nice thing about the number line task is that there's a really nice developmental trend between, let's say, first grade and fifth grade, where the fifth graders are almost close to where the adults are. And the first graders are just completely lost. So you get this really nice developmental trend there. And what you don't get, so you imagine if you're really bad at this task, you could be bad randomly. You could put 50 where 1 goes, and 80 where 10 goes. You could be kind of all over the place. They are not. They get the order very, very correct. So if you just look at it ordinarily, they tend to know that 50 is further in this direction than 10 is. But they're just kind of off by a bit. Part of the reason why I really like this task is kind of a meta-scientific issue. The researcher there, Siegler, at least for psychologists, kind of had a monopoly on it. I mean, it's not like he made other people not do it. He just came out like 10 papers on it before anyone else really did anything. So it's really interesting to see how people's thoughts about the number line have progressed over time. There's kind of competing ideas about how it works that I'll get into. And what people think about it now is very different from what they used to think about it. So when you look at the data for this is the way you draw it. On the horizontal axis is what the target value actually is. The vertical axis is kind of where you actually put it. Most adults are near perfect. You're not made exactly perfect, but you're close. So if I give you 25, you'll roughly put it where 25 goes. So adult data basically looks like a straight line. And this is what, so by young children I mean first graders or something. They're bad. So they tend to do things like put 25 where 85 goes. So you get this really exaggerated, almost logarithmic-like shape. And as they get older, it keeps that shape, but it gets a little closer to vertical. So that might be like, say, second graders or so. So there's a couple of questions. One is, why the red, so the red one of the young children, why are they like that? Why aren't they like this or something like that? So they're not just randomly bad, they're bad in a very particular way. And the second question is, what is the progression here? So what is changing when children are getting better? What is the process that's going on from what you see from young children to older children to adult-like behavior, which you'll get around, let's say, 5th grade or so. So what I did back in 2009, 10, is try to create kind of a computational model of those neural tuning curves and try to relate how those look with how people are doing on this task for young children, older children, and for adults. So the two questions are, why do children produce those nonlinear estimations, so the exaggerated logarithmic shape, and what is the developmental change here? So why are they getting better at this? What could be changing about their representation of knowledge? So here's how we did it. So if you create a computational model of these neural tuning curves, they just kind of look like these things that look like kind of not quite normal distribution curves that have been kind of skewed in one direction or another. I mentioned before, one thing that you can adjust is the breadth of them. So even if they have the same peak, one can be narrow and one can be broad. So our hypothesis here was that young children just have very broad neural tuning curves. Older children have more precise, more narrow tuning curves. So even if the two cases here between the blue line and the black line, both of those are neural tuning curves that are supposed to represent the number 18. The way I indicate that is the peak is at 18 on the horizontal axis. So the way these neural tuning curves work, whatever the peak is, that is the number that it is, quote, representing. So the maximum firing rate is a neural population for that value. So in this case, it is 18. If it was further along, let's say it was in the middle, it might be 450. And what we think is that the broader tuning curves correspond to younger children. They get better. So for the older children, as they become more precise. And the idea here is that, remember back in the monkey paper, I said that the behavioral errors seem to be linked to neural tuning curve errors. So what does an error look like in the neural tuning curve? The idea here is that the peak moves. So you're supposed to be representing 18, but let's say you have really broad neural tuning curves that are really imprecise. The peak firing rate is supposed to be the neural population for 18. But if you're really imprecise, maybe what actually happens when you implement this is that the peak value is at 21. And so the idea here is that you're misestimating 18 as 21 because you don't have the internal processes for representing these that you have are basically very messy. So the idea here is that the neural tuning curves for the younger children are very messy and they tend to make errors. And the errors that they tend to make correspond to the errors that you see on the number line task. So you can think about it just looking here, think about where that peak could move to. For the really broad tuning curve, it's not going to take much error for the peak to move over because you have a lot of other values that are also high. For the really narrow one, the black one, the peak is really far removed from most of the other values, so it would take a lot of error for that peak to move much, and it's not going to move quite as much. So the expectation here is that younger children are much more likely to make an overestimation error than older children are, because they have more broad tuning curves than younger children do. So you can model this really quickly in MATLAB. It's actually really easy once you've already done it. As I said, so we ran out two modeling conditions, one with broad neural tuning curves, one with narrow. The task is just for it to estimate values from 1 to 100. So what I am doing is I am kind of abstracting the number line task out. So we're not really doing anything spatial, we're just trying to represent number values and seeing what happens. So we look at the types and the magnitudes of the errors. So how big are the errors? Are they small misestimations or really big? And are they overestimations or underestimations? So here's the actual data from one of the Siegler papers. This was a long time ago, so I had to actually just load this up on my computer and measure where the dots were to figure out what the values were, because people weren't, it wasn't as common to share data. He might have said yes if I had asked. He's really good at that. But I just kind of blew it up on the screen. So this is the actual data looks like. So this is kindergartners. Kindergartners doing 0 to 100 or 1 to 100 number line. You can see it has that logarithmic shape to it. So they're really greatly overestimating a lot of the values. You take a model with a broad neural tuning curve and have it make estimations for the same values. And this is what you get. Looks really nice. So the model with really broad neural tuning curves is really close to what the kindergartners are doing. Take the same model and all you do is make the tuning curves a little sharper and look at the third graders. So the third graders are closer to living. If you're familiar with this area of research, there's a couple of issues here about how it's not exactly linear, it almost kind of looks like an S-curve. That's a whole other thing I can get into. But if you take the same model, make the tuning curves a little more precise, you get something a little more like that. Not a perfect match, but a lot closer to what the third graders are doing as opposed to what the kindergartners are doing. So it seems like, to some degree, modeling the precision of these neural tuning curves. So thinking about how this changes over time, from when you were a kindergartner to when you were a third grader, it seems to correspond very nicely with the actual behavioral changes in how people do on number line tasks. So, this worked out pretty well. Got a nice publication out of it. And the basic idea here is that these kind of logarithmic misestimations on a number line task could be, in part, a consequence of the neural coding of number. So the misestimation happens because of the shape of the neural tuning curves. They're actually kind of positively skewed. So when you make errors, it's going to more likely be an overestimation than an underestimation. And the change in the breadth, going from really broad to relatively narrow tuning curves, corresponds with the developmental change where they improve their performance on this task. They still make overestimations on average, but they make them much smaller. And so you can see that change from the kindergartners to the first graders to the fourth graders or adults as partly being driven by these changes in how they are able to represent number in the number area. Right? Now, what I did here, so the paper itself is just modeling data. It's also group data. So I'm talking about kindergartners in general, or first graders or adults. I'm not talking about individual variation in between them. So what we kind of pivoted to do after that is to look more at individual variation. So why some people are doing relatively well in these tasks and some people are doing relatively poorly. And then not only look at one task at a time. If we think what we're modeling is about number cognition in general, it shouldn't just be that one task that we kind of overfit the data to. We should be able to look at all sorts of things, so comparison or addition and things like that. So that's kind of like the direction we're going in. The first attempt for this was to look at the number line task and number comparison. So all that stuff I told you about for the neural tuning curves, can I take that and then link it not just to the number line task, not just to number comparison, but both at the same time? So you can't just do one and then take the model, reset it, and then do the other one. Let's take the same model. So if you're trying to model a particular individual, you have all these specifications for how to draw these neural tuning curves. Once you have those set, then you have to model that participant's data on multiple tasks without changing anything. So if I think that there's some underlying thing that varies between individuals that has a lot to do with how well you're doing on these tasks, then for each person, I should be able to set it to a particular value and model that person's data across multiple tasks. It's a lot harder than it sounds. Well, it does sound hard, so it's still a bit harder than it sounds. So I first attempted this with number comparison and number estimation. Remember, the whole idea, it was about variations in the breadth of these tuning curves. They're either relatively broad or relatively narrow. It actually works really well for each of these tasks individually if you do it by itself and don't link them up and say you have to do the data for one participant for both of these tasks. So we took a look at 5 to 8-year-olds on these two different tasks. And this is a great age range because the difference between the 5-year-olds and the 8-year-olds is a lot. 5-year-olds are just messing around. They're doing really poorly on both of these tasks. And 8-year-olds they're not at adult levels, but they're really good. They're like, this is really easy. Why am I only here for this? And what we do find, so one, there's a strong relationship between the two. So if you're doing the symbolic number line task and also non-symbolic comparison task, people who are good at one are usually good at both. Even if you account for age, if you kind of regress out the age-based variations, there's a really strong correlation between the two. So, can we model this correlation in a way that works relatively well? So our initial hypothesis was about just the precision of the neural tuning curves. Are they really precise or really broad? We attempted to fit them both by varying a couple things about the model. So there's the neural tuning curve precision. So the way the math works out, there's just this one specification that either shrinks it or makes it very broad. So you can just have that specification vary a lot. You can also put in a little bit of noise. So when we're calculating these neural tuning curves, they're not these kind of perfect shapes. They're a little noisy. That's a little more realistic. You can vary how much noise is in it. There's a tiny little bit of noise. Nothing really changes. If there's too much noise, you just kind of vary that. So we had both of those vary for the model. The way we did this is that each individual participant has their own model. It's like they get their own pet, right? So each individual participant has their own version of the model that's just for them. We use kind of an evolutionary algorithm to make adjustments to the different models so that each person has their own model fit. Evolutionary algorithm, if you don't know much about it, is really a fancy word for kind of like guess and check. So you have this way of changing these two specifications over and over again to figure out what combination works best for that individual participant. You press a button and that lab does it for a while and says, okay, this one's done, this is as good as it can be, then it goes over to the next one, this is as good as it can be. So the question is, if I do that for everyone, can everyone get just like a perfect model fit just from those two specifications? The answer is no, sadly. So it works kind of relatively well, but even if you just kind of eye test it and look at how well it works, you can kind of clearly see that there's a lot of variation that isn't being captured from the model just using kind of the neural tuning curve variation. So what it really seems like is that it's part of the story, so variations in neural tuning curve can do a lot for you, but it probably isn't everything. So there seems to be a lot of variation, individual variation left that we can't really account for just using those different variables in the model. So the question is, well, what is it? Does anyone have any ideas?
So I was curious about the amplitude.
Amplitude?
Yeah,
Yeah.
like you could have, I mean, so variation in the amplitude is going to correlate with variation in width, right? To some degree. Wouldn't it be harder to have the same width for a tuning curve that's very much taller?
Potentially.
That's just something I was wondering about.
So I have another paper that looks at amplitude a little bit because the lower numbers tend to have higher amplitudes and the larger numbers have lower ones. It's possible that's part of the story. I imagine it's probably something that is statistically significant but does not move the whole thing significantly. But I have attempted to model it. Do you have any stuff?
I was wondering if the model was appropriate for people who have different languages as their first language and people who have different curricula or exposed to, would that be, have you looked at differences in, or are these variables that you're incorporating to your model somehow?
I don't think language would be an issue for these tasks. I do think, so the number line task, we kind of assume that they know, right?
Yeah.
And everyone we've tested knows it, but everyone I've tested is a kid who went through school in the U.S. I'm sure there's some variation in curriculum, but not a huge amount. So the number space thing, I assume that they already have a lot of experience with that. So it would be interesting to find people who are older but have less experience with number lines. They might not.
So it seems sort of implausible that the symbolic and non-symbolic would completely share representations, right? Especially at some point, right?
Right.
Like I know what a million is, but I doubt there's a part of my parietal lobe that's selectively biased to a million or negative 50, right? So at some point there's got to be some extra representations coming in somewhere, right? For this.
That's an excellent question, which I'll kind of get to later. But yes.
So I was thinking that the commonality between both these tasks is that they're both visual spatial. But the the dot comparison is sort of, it's comparative. The number line is more like fractions. So you take the whole continuum, you have to figure out where the middle is and where the half of the middle is. So those seem kind of different. So I'm saying what Jeff is saying in a different way. So I'm curious that the model you had worked nicely for both tasks separately. I'm sort of curious that happened. And if that's true, I'm puzzled as to why they wouldn't happen together.
Right.
I wouldn't have guessed that they would both, with the same
Well,
model, would work on both
I would say the
tasks.
model worked kind of well, but I think the issues that you point to, we're kind of getting to that. So there's the non-symbolic to symbolic jump, which maybe is too big of a difference at that point. So So let me get to like what I have later because it actually addresses some of that. So what I shifted to doing instead is going back kind of down and thinking about these two tasks a little more deeply. Instead of trying to, so part of the use of computational model is trying to link a lot of different things. So you have individual learners, you have their performance across multiple tasks, you have things you know about the learner. Maybe they're not specific to number, like their executive functioning, maybe there's some neuroscience data. The nice thing about computational model is kind of bringing all that together. Remember, like the second slide, I had the thing about the learner and all these things about the learner that you're trying to model. The other thing you can do with models is trying to model all these processes. So if I just go way down in kind of a low-level analysis and I say, you're doing non-symbolic comparison, what are all the processes involved in getting to a point where you can make a decision? So like modeling the decision process where I'm just really diving into one particular task and saying, I'm modeling all the processes in that task. So that's what I decided to do next. So I have separate studies, one for the number line and one for comparison, trying to look more into what we think is going on in doing those tasks. And you know, one interesting thing about the comparison task, as much as it's been used, I don't know, so a lot of the data is really just kind of about individual variation and how that correlates with other things. I don't know how much we know about exactly what all the low-level cognitive processes involved in doing it actually are or have to be. The interesting thing about this task is, you know, it's basically just judgment and decision-making. The number of people don't necessarily talk to the judgment decision-making people at all. So if you show this to someone, if you say are walking the hallways in SFN and you go to the judgment decision-making people and show them this, and they're kind of like, yeah, of course. Why is this about number? You know, maybe it's about density or something like that. So I tried to go in and think about what is going on when you're doing this task, where are the cognitive processes involved. And if you kind of think about it like a decision-making person, when they make models of decision processes, so just like forced choice, two option decisions, you know, partly they think about the evidence, like how you weight the evidence that you have. So there's a separate part than kind of representing the two options. One is like how do you weight what you know about those two things. So initially all I was modeling is the neural tuning curves. I kind of assumed when you had those, then you just kind of do the task. But there's probably something in between there, and you can kind of think about some sort of decision process layer. So you think about this like neural networks. You have the initial representation layer of the two numbers you're looking at. Then you have to have some sort of decision process that decides which one is the larger one. And maybe there's individual variation in the decision-making process that is not captured in just looking at individual variation in those neural tuning curves. So how do I do that? I have to figure out some way to get a measure of what people's kind of neural tuning curve precision is. Like how do I figure out if you have really precise narrow neural tuning curves or really broad without involving a decision-making process? Because I have to like get away from that. So what I tried to do is come up with a task of a way of measuring these neural tuning curves or kind of estimating for each individual that is separate from looking at their decision-making process when they're doing number comparison. So I'm going to give you tests. This is the same thing that the participants see. This is not number comparison anymore. It's not easy. It's not left or right. What this is just number estimation. So tell me how many dots are on the screen. No counting.
27.
49.
Totally wrong. Okay. Try it again.
50.
40.
If anyone says the right
50,
number,
40.
I'll give you
60,
something.
60.
You can't just say all the numbers. Try one more time.
38.
47.
Oh, I was gonna-
Someone was really close. But you didn't get it. Okay. I tricked you. Those are all the same number. Answer was 37. So here's what I did in this study. There are two different tasks. They both use those kind of stimuli. One is comparison. So you would get something that looks like this and another version of this that has less or more. So that's your basic number comparison task. The other is estimation. So I show you this and you tell me how many there are. So there are a couple different things to look at for the estimation task. One is the accuracy. You guys were way off. So it's almost a 38. Good job. The other is
the third time.
The third time. But so that's the thing. So how consistent are you? So I don't tell the participants they're seeing the same one over and over again. I actually mix it with a set of other numbers. But what they'll end up seeing is they'll see the 37 stimulus that looks slightly different. 5 times? 10? I can't remember the details. A large number of times, so we can estimate their standard deviation. So you can look at their precision. So even if they're way off, let's say they're way off consistently. Every time I show them 37, they say 50. That'd be pretty impressive. Like every time I showed you 37, no matter what, you said 50. You'd be wrong, but you'd be consistent. So you've seen the thing with the arrows and the thing about the difference between precision and accuracy. You can be precise but not accurate, or accurate but not precise. I have to explain this to reviewers. Accuracy and precision are not the same thing. You can have one without the other. You're not necessarily going to have both, even though you might expect it. If you have one, you would have the other. So what we try to do is model this and see how much precision goes in terms of if we get everyone's precision for their neural tuning curve from the estimation task, does that explain really well how well they do on the comparison task? So if you're really precise on the estimation task, does that mean, oh, you're going to get a ceiling for the comparison task? It doesn't. So there is a little, there's a moderate correlation between accuracy and precision, but it's not particularly that high. Precision really only goes so far. So when I try to model how well people do on both of these tasks, just using precision, so varying the neural tuning curve width, it does relatively well. If you add in a little bit of extra on the model when it is doing the comparison task, so like a decision layer that kind of goes further, adding in the decision layer does a lot better. So if you make the number comparison task a two-step task, where you evaluate the numbers with the neural tuning curves and then have a decision layer that can either be very kind of loose, like, oh, who knows, or very kind of tight, that models the behavior on the comparison task a lot better, even if you're taking the data from the estimation task. So it seems like when we look at individual differences on the number comparison task, it's a combination of the precision of their neural tuning curves and some sort of kind of decision-making variable about how they're weighting evidence when they're looking at two variables. You imagine you might get, so the next thing to do is to give them a decision task that is not number, where we could look at kind of this decision-making variable and see if it's the same when we do some other thing like size, or the decision-making people like using things like motion endurance, things like that. We'll take that and then apply it to the comparison task with number and see if it is the same. So the other thing that I'm doing is looking at the number line task. So this is very new, so this is currently under review. I'll let you guys know about it. So remember before I said I thought the number line task was really interesting, partly because of how the discussion about it has progressed. So initially, the explanation for variation in the number line was just that children's mental number line, the kind of internal number line you have in your head, is initially logarithmic. And as you get older, you realize that's not good. You change it to make it more linear. And so then when you are older, like an adult, you have a linear number line, and so you perform like an adult on that task. A lot of people disagree with that, actually. And so there's this back and forth about what the number line task is about. Is it really about number, or it's not actually really about number, maybe it's about proportional reasoning. So you have the line that you really kind of have to divide up in your head. So even if you have a good idea of what 37 is, you need to look at the number line and figure out what that is proportionally. Because the number line is an actual physical thing you're looking at when they do this, whether it's on paper, on the computer screen, or I did a version of it where it's an actual meter stick. You couldn't see the markings on a meter stick. That was an actual physical thing that you're trying to get up and put a mark on. So maybe this is more about proportional reasoning. So there's this whole group of people whose argument argument is that this isn't really about number, it's more about proportional reasoning. Or is it something else? So what we decided to do is take a look at variations on the number line task to try to figure out what people are doing when they do this task. So we've come with a couple different versions of it. So initially, all the number line tasks were these kind of 1 to 1,000 style symbolic number line tasks where you get 2 endpoints. The first one is always 1, and the other end is 10 if you're really young, 100, 1,000, those kind of numbers. You don't necessarily have to do it that way. Another person created something called an unbounded number line, which kind of only really works on the computer, where instead of giving people both sides, you get kind of a unit. So there, maybe that length of that small blue line is 1. If I give you that unit length and ask you how long is 37, then you need to kind of multiply it out in your head or something like that. And the data looks a little bit different if you give them that version. But there's another version to consider. So I actually haven't seen a ton of this. A few people have done something like this. So imagine if you're a 4th grader in a symbolic number line task, you might see something like this. So where does 333 go between 1 and 1,000?
Third.
You can't just say it. There?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you know a lot about 333. What about that? Is it a third? It's not a third. Give me intuition. Sorry, fine. Okay, everyone agree on this? But then you get it again. Where to put it now? Yeah, I know. So it's tricky, right? It's the same number target, but I'm switching up what the input values are. So the idea here is that, well, if the assumption is how you're doing on the task is just about your representation of the number, what if I keep the number the same and switch up other aspects of it? Is that going to kind of throw off whatever you were at up here, however variable you were here? Is it going to be consistent when you get these sorts of things, or is it going to be different? So it's actually kind of interesting. People can do this, so I'm doing this with adults. They don't like it, it's not the most fun. But they're definitely above chance. I feel like they're guessing, but they kind of roughly know. Like if I made this 340, everyone say, oh yeah, this is towards the end, it's somewhere like that. So if you take a look at this data, there's a couple of interesting things you can do. So here I've got a bound number line, so that's the kind of classic one, 1 to 1,000. The unbound, that's the one where you get a unit and you have to kind of figure out how long it is. And this, I'm calling it repeated number line because I can give you the same number over and over again with different endpoints. The nice thing about that is I can see how variable you are on the same one. Even when so you get the same value, but you're getting really different endpoints. So they're pretty good at this. On the bound number line, they're near linear, so that's the green. We got something odd going on the unbound number line. What does it look like here?
It's 2 groups.
It looks like 2 groups. So here's what happened with that. On the unbound number line, remember the unit I gave you was 1. That's actually kind of tricky logistically, because if you make it 1 and you want the number to be 500, it's not going to work here. So if you look at the unbound number line papers, they tend to use smaller numbers. I want to use bigger numbers. So what can you do to use bigger numbers? Other than make you can make the line smaller, but that only goes so far.
Do area.
What?
Do area. Draw a square.
Oh, that's good.
Bigger
I didn't do that. That's a good idea.
Bigger unit.
Bigger unit. So make the unit 10 or 50 or something like that. So we had varying units. I think I had 1, 10, and 50. The two things you see is what the unit is. So it's like when the unit is 1, it's these. When the unit is anything else, it's that. So there's something kind of odd going on there. And the other thing for the repeated number line, I only got to do so many numbers. They're kind of bunched up here, but you can see they're more spread for the smaller ones. So here's what this is, though. This isn't the actual value. This is proportionally where the value is. So given a line of some length, call that length 100. So this is when the actual value should go at a third. So whatever the value is, whatever the endpoints are, if the answer is about a third, I graph those right here. And you can see this looks a lot like what you would get from my model. You get a lot of variability and an overestimation here. You get less variability and less of an overestimation here. It's not the raw number value, it's where it goes proportionally on the line. So I think this is kind of really interesting in thinking about what the number line is. It seems like it's partly being driven by where your estimation is on the number line. So you're doing this proportional thing. If the estimation is lower, it seems like you're more likely to have this overestimation here with a lot of variability. If the estimation is over here, there seems to be a lot less variability. So we're kind of unclear exactly what is going on here. It seems there's this, I don't know if they're necessarily mutually exclusive, but you can think about it being about the actual number representation and also being about proportionally where are you in the line. So there's variations of the number line that's not numbered. There's a variation where it's A and Z, and I give you a letter, and the data looks somewhat similar. I think you still get that, but at least with kids.
Are these speeded tasks, or do participants have as long as they want to complete them?
They have as long as they want. I'm assuming they are not getting out a ruler and measuring things. Like we know how much time they take, and they don't feel like taking that much time because they get paid if they get it wrong anyway. So it's like make your best guess.
What age group is this?
This is adults. So and this is online adults, so it really is just adults. It's 18 to 65. And so I don't know how much time do I have? I don't want to just keep going forever.
I'd say maybe till like 1:15, 1:20, and make some time for questions.
Oh, okay. Okay, so that's what I'm doing with the number line right now. We're working on trying to figure out what exactly is going on. Is it more number representation or kind of proportional reasoning? Those two might not be mutually exclusive, so maybe it's a mix of both. It really just depends on how the task is presented. There's also a version of this that is speeded that you can give to adults. And when you speed adults up, they look more like kids. They tend to have that overestimation. Or if you give adults really large numbers, like billions, they're really bad at it because they don't actually go all those numbers. So lastly, I'm kind of talking a little bit about some of the future research we are doing, which is about making these models a lot more complicated and hopefully a little bit more useful. One thing we're doing is adding in EEG. So I showed you guys at the beginning, I've got my portable EEG. So the nice thing about that now is that when we have studies where people come into the lab, it's relatively trivial to strap the EEG on their head. We got a version that is quick to put on, so that's nice for kids because they're not going to sit there forever. Adults, you can have them sit there for 25 minutes. They can play on their phone while you put the EEG out. I guess kids can do that too, but they get a little impatient. And the other thing that we're doing is trying to model everything. And by that, I do kind of mean that somewhat literally. So the first step is using the neural data to inform the computational models. So the idea here, the approach that I'm taking is that we're modeling the learner. So you can think about this two ways. You can kind of model the learner as part of this whole state that includes their external environment, background about their behavior, things about the task they are doing. So it's not just that you're modeling the individual learner, you're modeling something slightly above that that includes the learner and their behavior. But you can think about like when they're in a classroom. There's a lot of things going on when you're in the classroom. You know, your neighbor is talking a lot, or you didn't eat breakfast that day, and so you're not doing really well. Teachers know that there are a lot of things that influence the day-to-day behavior for their children, or maybe one year something happens and you know you have a bad year because you have some external variable that has nothing to do with your schoolwork that's affecting your behavior. Teachers know that, but my model doesn't know that. My model is just kind of treating everything as being kind of abstract. So what we're trying to do is put those sorts of things into the model. So EEG is part of that, and that helps us try to customize the models for each individual learner because we can get some reliable data about the kind of neural responses to these different tasks. And so I mentioned before, you know, we're creating these neural tuning curves. At first I was just kind of roughly estimating them based on behavior, but by including things like EEG, we know that there's a little bit of variation in EEG on that number comparison task that seems to have to do with whether or not you're doing a difficult one, like 50 versus 51, versus easy one, like 50 versus 10. And that kind of what they call a distance effect, which is really just kind of variations in the amplitude of the ERP. I don't know if everyone knows about it. But basically people will look at variations in these amplitudes. You can break it down, you can average it across groups, or you can try to look at individual differences. Apparently that's relatively new in EEG, trying to look trial by trial at individual data because it is kind of noisy. So that turned out to be more difficult than I noticed. But we're trying to integrate that into the models. So we actually took a first attempt with adults. This is actually on an older system before I got the new one. Just seeing that if adding in EEG improves how well the model can predict behavior. So if I have my models of these neural tuning curves, does adding in data for each individual participant about where their EEG signal is when they are doing these tasks actually improve how well the model is able to fit? Turns out that's a tricky question. If you're trying to just determine how good does the model fit this one particular thing, it's not always straightforward how to define that fit or how to define that same error in the model. And if their two models are different, how big is that difference? Is that difference significant? Not just statistically, but kind of in there. So in this, we basically have a model of the number comparison task using those neural tuning curves. They have kind of two neural tuning curves corresponding to two values, P1 and P2. There's a decision layer that decides which one is the larger one. And so we can kind of model this process and make adjustments based on the ERP data. And you can make the adjustments for each individual participant. So you can do it two ways. You could get an average for one participant and say, this person's relatively good based on their ERP data, make adjustments for that person, and then have the model of those single person adjustments go over all the trials. Or you can try to do it trial by trial. You can say, on this trial, which is 50 versus 51, this is the ERP data I've got for this participant, and have the model make an adjustment on that trial based on the data from that particular trial. So that's what we're trying to do. And the way that works is that we can kind of weight the decision based on the ERP amplitude. So looking at areas where we expect there to be fluctuation based on this comparison, we can say, okay, in this time frame, we saw a certain amplitude from this participant. What we're going to do is we're going to really weight it. We think that this is a trial that we're definitely getting right. And we can weight the decision and make the model really quick to say one side is larger than the other. Or we can weight it the other direction, basically kind of giving the model noise, making the model kind of wishy-washy, not really sure if it's going to make a decision, and then that's more likely to get that one wrong. So that works relatively well with a bunch of caveats. One caveat is that it works well on a small subset of the trials, basically on hard ones. The easy ones, you know that they're going to get them right. So it's not that interesting. The model gets it right, the participant gets it right, you know that's going to happen. So you have to focus on the really difficult ones. The way we thought about it is we're looking for a signal for getting it incorrect. So basically what it turns out to be is that we have a somewhat reliable signal from the ERP on which trials that are getting incorrect. And we use that to predict where the incorrect trials are. And we're able to relatively well predict how well people are doing on a trial-by-trial basis. Now the tricky thing about this, so we looked at a couple of different channels. So the ERP has, the EAG has 32 channels. We looked at a few that are associated with variation in number. They're in these kind of parietal areas. I'm somewhat agnostic about which channel might be the best data, partly because there's going to be variation in exactly where it is. So the spatial location of the channel on one person might be slightly different than another. So if it works best for one person for P3 and another person for P7, to me it's not kind of a huge deal. So we looked at a couple of different channels. We also tried one version where there's no ERP input. And so you adjust all these model specifications, again, using the evolutionary algorithm. It ends up being a lot of versions of the model. So it's all over 3,000 kind of instantiations of the model that get checked, at least to see how well they fit. The data is kind of tricky to look at. You can look at this by participant. So on the horizontal axis is each individual participant. This is the overall error, so the higher it is on here, the more error there is. And these different shapes here are the different model types. So you can see that the black one, which is no ERP input, tends to be higher. It's not always the highest, but overall I would say it tends to be higher. And so what we found was actually kind of weirdly counterintuitive. So we had significantly lower model error for models that got input from P7 and TP7. However, remember I talked about the ERP distance effect, which is just this effect of whether or not you're doing a hard comparison like 50 and 51 or a close comparison. We got that effect as you would expect, so that's just kind of replication. We got that from the other channels, not the channels that are useful for the model. So this is kind of unexpected here. So the channels that were useful for the model in terms of improving its performance were not the channels that you saw the most reliable variation on in terms of the distance of the actual items that they are comparing. That's kind of tricky. I don't really know why. So we're working on figuring that out. I'm actually going to try to replicate this with the new system. This is old data of adults from the old system. But we're going to try to replicate it with the new system. So the tentative conclusion is that you can use trial-level ERPs to improve model fit. There's a lot of caveats there. If the participants are too close to ceiling, then it's hard to define or hard to have space to say that the model is working relatively well. So you need to make this actually really hard, which is hard to do with adults because they're pretty good at guessing on this. And we think that what we're getting is an ERP that is kind of signaling an error. Now that's a thing in ERP research, kind of error detection. So maybe that's what we're picking up on. It's just kind of some variation of that. So it isn't necessarily something number specific. One thing I always have to say is that I am not necessarily assuming that what we are looking at in the cognitive processes or the neural data is specific to number only. It could be something more general. So I kind of want to wrap up with that because there's a lot more on ongoing projects, some of which we've started. So looking at parent measures of the home. So we're trying to get measures of the environment. Asking the parents about the home is helpful. Actual environmental measures. So if you want to know more about it, we're doing a study on air pollution and cognitive development, which I think might be interesting. Affective state. I have a lot of colleagues that study motivation, so they're constantly asking me about that. So I gave in and said maybe motivation is important for math. Could be. And also a lot of math people are into looking at more general cognitive skills like executive function. So particularly when you use tasks that are a little more complex, like arithmetic, that you're doing in the classroom, Variations in cognitive function, like executive functioning, working memory, are going to be really important. And so we can't kind of ignore these and just make it really just specifically about them. And with that, that's it. Thank you.
Really nice talk. As a mom of a first grader, I'm fascinated that my son might be thinking logarithmically. It seems like you're mostly focused on the how of numeracy, and I was just wondering if you thought, or what's the thinking about the sort of ultimate explanation, or why the evolutionary explanation, because apologies to any cultural anthropologists in the room, but I remember hearing some study about an indigenous community that has like native language for 1 through 5 and then many or something. I'm probably getting that wrong. So is it just the idea that like we didn't used to need to know what 1,000 was, and and in our society now we're kind of, so that's why maybe billions also we're bad at, because we still don't need to know that?
Oh yeah, so this kind of gets into another question on this. Yeah, so you don't need to know what 1,000 is. I guess kind of evolutionary perspective. So think of it almost like reading. It's a tool that you learn. So symbolic numbers are like a cognitive tool that you have learned, right? And a lot of the work that I do kind of attaches what are most likely not things that were designed, so to speak, while that cognitive tool existed. So if you think about number cognition without all the cognitive tools you learn in society, so just like symbolic number, then it's mostly just about more or less. So it's more ordinal than cardinal. So you're just kind of comparing things, knowing when two things are about the same, and you can kind of think of it as almost part of perception. So it's kind of a step away from perceptual things like which of those sounds was louder, or which of these two things is heavier. And that's partly where the logarithmic thing comes from. It's just proportional. So you can think about it as just being, twice as much is the same. So it's not the linear difference between the numbers, it's proportional difference between them. And that, if you think about it as being proportional, that works out well with kind of a logarithmic number line that you can see.
So I'm curious, you've talked about the use of like parental feedback, about that sort of environment. You've talked about individual variation. Is there anything in this study that looks at educational background, that looks at sort of what students have learned, what types of schools they're in, what these adults that you're working with, like what their background is? Because it strikes me that their mathematical cognition is probably pretty tied into their pedagogical background, right?
Yeah, I think the importance of that partly depends on what task you're looking at. I've studied with fractions. A lot of people remember learning some specific strategy with like comparing fractions and things like that. So for a fraction study, I think you would really need to ask people, because when I talk to people about fractions, like, oh yeah, I learned how to do that, and there's some little procedure that I remember. I don't know if it matters for the non-symbolic, because I kind of think about that as more just perceptual. For the number line, I think it could, but we haven't been asking adults or parents. So we do kind of ask them what grade they're in, as opposed to their age, because we know certain concepts are introduced to particular grades, and you could have an older first grader or a younger second grader be the same age, but be very different in terms of what they're exposed to in the classroom. So that's the primary thing that I think about right now. But there is variation in in the US, there is a little bit of variation, but a lot of them are kind of, in a lot of ways, closing in on very similar ways of teaching, although now I see what my son goes through, and it looks weird to me. So if you move up to addition, definitely when they start learning about how to add things and what the numbers mean, like multi-digit numbers, it's kind of all over the place. So in doing those sorts of tasks, we do have to ask a little bit about that.
I could just quickly follow up on that question. So I wonder if in your parent measures there are questions about sort of informal games parents play with their kids in a car or in, so, you know, is this more or less? And I think parents do that mostly to keep their kids occupied, right? And so do you have parental measures that assess whether parents or whether families have these informal games or tasks that they do, and whether that correlates with performance on any of your tasks?
So we do. There is definitely a whole area of math research focused on linking parents' behavior and children's behavior. We have, so people look at how often are you informally talking about number? Do you talk about more versus less? Do you talk about specific number values? And it varies a lot. So parent talk about number, if you just give them a self-assessment, can vary a lot. Another thing that varies is when people look at math anxiety, so how they talk about it. If they talk about it as something that is really difficult and that you should be kind of scared of, which is absolutely how some parents talk about it, you see that transfer to children's behavior. So there's a lot of work on parent measures that is working out, showing some real links. I've only done it for one study, and we didn't find as much as we expected, but we were looking at a particular set of things. And so it's not that I'm saying it doesn't matter, just for the one thing that we looked at, it didn't seem to be as strong.
And as you said, the link between your tasks and what the parents are asked, the tighter the link, or like the greater the likelihood I would imagine that there might be an association.
Yeah, I was thinking, as far as explaining that sort of logarithmic distribution, I was thinking one way you could explain that is to narrow the curve, but another thing you could do is sort of like 20 questions. If you can correct for having guesses that are way off by just asking more questions. So like when I do that task, what I first do is find 50 and then use that to find 75 and then use that to find, so you can sort of make up for imprecision on any one guess by just stacking guesses. Like you can kind of home in that way. And so I thought it might be reasonable to think that older kids would do more of that, placing numbers they haven't been asked to place on the line as reference points. So the more steps like that you do, the more sort of invisible reference points you create, the more precise you'll end up being in the end. But you could, I mean, that's the kind of thing you can test because you can see how long it's taking to do it or that sort of thing.
People definitely do that a little bit. So if you have a number near halfway point, they tend to be relatively good at that. So you can see the error goes down a little bit as you get close to the midpoint because they're kind of doing that. Saying, oh, it's but yeah, I mean, it might be interesting to, so people who do fraction work do that a lot because there's a lot of very explicit thinking because people don't feel good about fractions, they have to think it out. So you do fraction number line, which everyone hates. But there's some interesting work on that, on figuring out where it goes by knowing where other things are on the fraction number.
So I think I've heard, but you can verify if this is true or not, that if you take your linear number line adults, you can make them kids again by putting a million.
Yeah, if you give them really large numbers or speed it up so they can't sit there and think about it.
So now they're longer.
Yeah.
So if I had to say it colloquially, I would say like they don't understand how big the number is. Right? Kids don't understand how big 100 is. And they get 15 and they're like, yeah, that's a pretty big number. So they move it, right? And adults don't understand how big a million is. So you give them 15,000 and they're like, that's a big number.
Right.
So they put it up. Does that sort of colloquial story map on to the neural tuning story at all, or would that be?
Yeah, so the neural tuning story I think is complicated with large numbers because, right, I don't think that you have a specific neural population sitting around waiting for 15 million. But you can do a task with 15 million, like you might not be great at it, but you can think about it as a number. So it's clearly not the case that you need a kind of specific neural tuning curve for a number value in order to think about it. So part of what I think it is making these kind of adjustments for like, what's a big number, right? So in some contexts, 15,000 is a big number. In some contexts, it's a really small number. And so you need to be able to like take a specific number and make it a big number sometimes and make it a small number other times. And so I think that's kind of what people are doing. They have kind of big number neurons and small number. And you need to be able to match the specific number to where it needs to be in a particular context. And right, the kids are doing really bad at that with relatively small numbers, and adults are doing really bad at that with big numbers like a billion and 200,000. Like, how much is 200,000 of a billion?
Very small.
It's very small, right? But like, how small is small? So I do think there's this tricky thing about reasoning about numbers that you don't have a lot of experience with.
One last question?
Oh.
Yeah, okay, we can duke it out. So I study children with developmental disabilities, and I'd be curious to know if any of this work has been replicated in children with autism as a particular sort of subgroup, because they naturally, stereotypically speaking, are better at number. I don't study number, as a total disclaimer, but I'd be curious to know what we can actually learn about brain areas for number and processing by studying a population like that. Do you know if anybody's doing it?
Not offhand. I mean, I know a lot of people now do language. Like if they do a measure with children with autism, right into the language. So I don't know offhand someone who's doing those things specifically. I think it would be interesting to know, because I'd be curious if they are stereotypically better at the kind of low-level number things,
Yeah, I
like
don't
the
know.
non-symbolic, versus the more symbolic. Because the tasks involve, even though they're all number tasks, they involve using different things, different strategies, different processes. So it'd be interesting to see how they would do a number line task versus multiple digit addition and subtraction and things like that.
All right, let's thank Richard again.